It began, as many stories of espionage do, in silence. The kind of silence that hums like a hell breath before the world changes. Over the English Channel, a small aircraft drifted through a pocket of darkness. The clouds were heavy, glinting faintly under a reluctant moon. Inside the plane, a man sat alone, his parachute packed tightly against his back, a pistol tucked beneath his jacket, and a heart trained to betray both fear and loyalty in equal measure. His name was Eddie Chapman, safecracker, thief, prisoner, and soon spy. He wasn't the kind of man one might expect to be recruited for His Majesty's Secret Service. But then, the war had a way of bending the rules, of making strange heroes out of broken men. The crew signaled. The door opened. A rush of cold air flooded in, sharp, metallic, alive. Chapman stood, looked once toward the distant landmass of Europe below, and smiled, that familiar crooked grin that could charm or deceive at will. Then he stepped out into nothing. The night swallowed him whole. Below him stretched the sleeping fields of occupied Norway, though in later years, his name would echo through Berlin, through Gestapo halls, and across the secret corridors of Whitehall. But on that first ascent, all he could hear was the low hiss of wind through silk and the pounding of his own heart. He landed in the dark, near a frozen meadow dusted with snow, his parachute collapsing like a ghost behind him. The earth smelled of pine and gunpowder. In the distance, dogs barked, or perhaps they didn't. Sometimes memory adds its own warnings, long after danger has passed. Chapman crouched, listening, his breath a fog of quiet panic. He was back behind enemy lines, not as a soldier, but as something stranger. A man who belonged to no side. Years later, as I studied his photograph in a yellowed file, I wondered what kind of courage lives in men like him. Or was it not courage at all, but a restless hunger, the thrill of playing the most dangerous game imaginable, and winning not through strength, but deceit? He gathered his parachute, buried it under a thin crust of snow, and walked toward the nearest village. He would introduce himself as Fritz, a loyal German returned home after years abroad. It was the beginning of a deception so elaborate that even those who trained him could scarcely believe how far it would go. And as the morning light began to thaw the frost from the pine needles, Eddie Chapman, the thief, the liar, the spy, vanished into occupied Europe. But to understand the man who vanished that night, we must return to the beginning, to a world before parachutes and passwords, to the smoke-filled bars and glittering grime of London in the 1930s, where Eddie Chapman first learned the art of the double life. Before he was Agent Zigzag, Eddie Chapman was simply Eddie, a working-class boy from the north, restless, quick with his hands and quicker with his tongue. London, in the years between wars, was a city of contradictions. Its fog rolled in like spilled ink, and its streets pulsed with jazz and desperation. Men who had returned from the Great War with medals often found themselves sleeping under bridges, while others, men like Chapman, found fortune in the shadows. He joined a gang that specialized in safecracking, a dangerous art that required both precision and nerve. Chapman had both. He could listen to the tumblers of a lock as if they were whispering secrets. His charm made him the darling of nightclub hostesses and the despair of Scotland Yard. There's a certain beauty in the audacity of thieves, and Chapman carried it like perfume. He dined with actresses, danced until dawn, and spent his earnings on champagne and tailored suits. Yet even then, he carried an emptiness, a craving for risk, for the sense that every moment teetered on the edge of disaster. His luck, however, ran out. In 1939, he was caught in Jersey, one of the Channel Islands, and imprisoned. Then came the war. And with it opportunity. When the Germans occupied Jersey, they found in their cells a collection of petty criminals. Among them, a man who spoke fluent charm and fluent lies. Chapman offered them a deal. He would work for Germany. He would parachute into Britain and carry out acts of sabotage. The Gestapo believed him. Perhaps they saw what the British had seen too late, a man who could deceive anyone, including himself. And so the thief became a spy. He trained under the Abwehr, the German intelligence agency. Learned to use explosives, codes, and radio transmitters. They gave him a new identity, money, and purpose. When he finally jumped from that plane, it was as a servant of the Reich. Or so they thought. Because Eddie Chapman, somewhere between his greed and his grin, had decided that his loyalties were for sale, but his soul, perhaps, was not. When he returned to Britain under false orders, it was not to destroy, but to negotiate, to play one side against the other. And in the quiet offices of MI5, the thief walked once more through the door of destiny. When Eddie Chapman returned to Britain, he did so as a ghost. Officially, he no longer existed. The Germans believed they had sent him as a saboteur, a loyal servant of their cause. The British, unaware of his survival, had long written him off as a criminal lost to the war. He landed once more on British soil with a story rehearsed in his mind, a story of German espionage, of explosives and missions. But beneath the practiced lies lay a flicker of truth. Chapman did not intend to serve Germany. Not truly. He had come home to play a deeper game. He surrendered himself to the authorities, asking to speak with someone from MI5. At first they laughed. A safecracker claiming to be a spy? It sounded like a film plot. Yet, when he began to reveal details of his German handlers, of their methods, their codes, and their training sites, the laughter faded. The British intelligence officers studied him carefully. His posture, his eyes, the casual way he smoked a cigarette while they questioned him. He seemed unbothered, almost amused. "Do you expect us to trust you?" one officer asked. Chapman smiled. "No," he said, exhaling. "But I expect you to need me." And so began one of the strangest alliances in wartime history, a career criminal working as a double agent for Britain, under the codename Zigzag. He was debriefed for days. Every detail of his German training was noted and verified. The Abwehr's plans to sabotage the de Havilland aircraft factory in Hertfordshire were real. But Chapman suggested a bold twist. He would pretend to carry out the attack, make the Germans believe it had succeeded, and feed them false intelligence from within Britain itself. It was madness. It was also genius. And MI5, ever the reluctant gambler, took the risk. They staged the explosion at the factory using small, controlled charges and photographic trickery. The photographs, when developed, showed a convincingly ruined facility. Chapman sent the images back to his German contacts, who accepted them as proof of his loyalty. The thief had become the perfect spy. In the months that followed, he lived a double life with unnerving ease. One moment, he was reporting to MI5 in a quiet office on Curzon Street. The next, he was composing encrypted messages to Berlin, speaking of non-existent sabotage missions, of British weaknesses that did not exist. Each report was a small victory, a lie that saved lives. I once read an MI5 memo about him. The handwriting was careful, almost admiring. "Chapman displays remarkable intelligence, resourcefulness, and composure. He appears to enjoy the game immensely." Enjoy the game. That was the key. For Chapman, espionage was not a burden. It was theater. But theater has its dangers. The longer a man wears a mask, the more he risks forgetting which face is his own, and in the winter of 1943, Eddie Chapman would find himself walking a perilous line between actor and traitor, loyalty and illusion. When Chapman was recalled to Germany for debriefing, the war had turned cold and uncertain. He arrived in Berlin dressed impeccably, his coat buttoned high, his story ready. The Abwehr officers greeted him as a hero. His supposed sabotage in Britain had been a success, his reports thorough. They offered him medals, women, and the promise of wealth. To them, he was Fritz, the faithful agent. But Berlin was a city unraveling. The night skies burned red from Allied raids. Smoke hung low over the spree. The cafes were still open, but conversation had grown quiet, even laughter carried a shadow. Chapman moved among them like a phantom, always listening, always careful. He sent secret messages back to MI5 through invisible ink and coded radio. To his German hosts, he was the perfect spy, to the British, the perfect deceiver. And yet, somewhere inside, I imagine he began to feel the weight of it. To lie so completely, one must become a fiction oneself. In a letter never sent, Chapman once wrote, "There are moments when I wonder which story is mine. I speak of sabotage and loyalty, but at night, when I remove the disguise, I am left with only silence. Perhaps that is what I am, a silence between nations." His skill at deception was so convincing that the Germans later offered him a new mission: to infiltrate British military networks once again, armed with fresh codes and money. Chapman agreed, and promptly informed MI5 of every detail. He was playing both sides, but also outsmarting both. He fed Germany false data about the success of their V-1 flying bombs, making them believe their rockets were striking London more accurately than they were. This subtle manipulation, historians later concluded, helped misdirect German targeting, saving countless lives. In a war of shadows, truth became a weapon, and Chapman wielded it with astonishing grace. But even masters of illusion must eventually come face to face with reality, and Chapman's double life, however clever, could not remain hidden forever. Spies are rarely lonely in fiction, but often utterly alone in life. In occupied France, Chapman met Betty Farmer, a young woman who believed he was simply a businessman working for the Germans. Their romance unfolded quietly, like a flicker of warmth in the cold machinery of war. Betty would later say that Eddie spoke little about himself, but his eyes carried stories of danger, of sadness, of strange affection for a homeland he could never openly claim. They lived for a time in a small apartment with a balcony overlooking the Seine. The city was scarred but alive, bakers still sold bread, lovers still met by the bridges, and every night, searchlights combed the sky as if looking for lost souls. Chapman's dual existence grew more fragile. He was in love, but his entire life was a lie told too well. When the Allies landed in Normandy, Berlin recalled him once again. The Germans trusted him completely, perhaps more than he deserved. And in that trust lay his power. He returned to England once more, this time carrying intelligence that would help MI5 manipulate German morale. But in his heart, he carried something else: guilt, maybe, or perhaps the quiet ache of knowing that Betty would never know the truth. He once wrote, "The hardest part of deception is not the lie itself, but the face that must wear it." As the war staggered toward its end, Eddie Chapman's usefulness began to wane. But the game, for him, was not yet over. There was one final mission, one last illusion, before the curtain would fall. By 1944, the war was beginning to fray at its edges. The German High Command, desperate for miracles, turned increasingly to men like Eddie Chapman, men who could deliver intelligence when bombs and prayers could not. When the summons came for another mission, Chapman accepted without hesitation. He knew it would likely be his last. The Abwehr asked him to return to Britain once more, to report on Allied troop movements and industrial output. To ensure his safety, they provided him with false papers, money, and a cyanide pill. He tucked the pill into his jacket pocket. Insurance, they called it. Back in Britain, MI5 received him like an old friend. The officers who had once doubted him now greeted him with warmth and quiet respect. They knew what he had done, and what he had risked. He had not only deceived Germany, but done so with such skill that his reports had shaped the enemy's entire understanding of British capability. His handlers asked him to maintain the illusion until the war's end. Chapman agreed. But beneath his charm, there was weariness, the kind that seeps into the bones of those who have lived too many lives. He no longer sought thrill or profit. The game had changed him. He drank more, laughed less. The easy swagger that once defined him was replaced by an introspective calm. In his reports, the flamboyant tone softened, the lies became cleaner, colder, almost mechanical. Still, his deception endured until the end. He continued to send false messages through coded radio, reporting on fictional sabotage missions and fabricated resistance groups. The Germans, even in their collapse, never suspected him. To them, Chapman was still their most trusted agent in Britain. In April 1945, when the Reich finally crumbled, Chapman was quietly retired. There were no medals, no parades, just a nod from his superiors and a file marked "Closed." The thief who had danced with empires simply faded from the record. But history, as I have learned, never truly ends. It lingers in small corners, in whispers, in half-burned letters, in the quiet reckoning that follows the noise of war. And Eddie Chapman's reckoning was still to come. When the guns fell quiet, the world did not become peaceful overnight. It simply became still, a stillness that frightened those who had lived too long on the edge. Eddie Chapman returned to civilian life with no applause and little guidance. The war had made him useful, peace made him unnecessary. MI5 offered him discreet assistance, but the double agent who had once tricked two nations now struggled to find meaning in a single life. He moved often, London, then the countryside, then abroad for brief spells. He lived off small business ventures, some honest, some less so. He married twice, divorced once, fathered children who would only later learn what he had done. He spoke rarely of his wartime exploits. When he did, it was with the air of a man describing a dream, vivid, unbelievable, and perhaps not entirely his own. I remember one recorded interview from years later. His voice, gravelly impatient, said, "They call me a hero. But I never thought of myself as one. I was just playing a part. The war gave me a stage, and when it ended, the curtain came down. The applause never came, but the silence did." He was neither celebrated nor condemned. He drifted into the twilight of his years with the same quiet mischief that had defined his youth. To some, he was a patriot. To others, a criminal who got lucky. But to himself, perhaps, he was merely Eddie, a man who had survived by being whoever others needed him to be. And yet, for those of us who study men like him, survival itself is a kind of truth, a reflection of how far humanity will go to find meaning amid chaos. That truth would come into focus one final time, years after the war, when a faded file landed on a historian's desk. It was a spring morning when I first opened the file marked Agent Zigzag. The paper smelled faintly of dust and tobacco, the ink faded to sepia. Inside were photographs, grainy shots of a man in uniform, another of him smiling beside a German officer, yet another of a wrecked factory that had never truly been destroyed. There were letters too, full of crossed-out lines and hesitant words. Reports from MI5 officers, describing Chapman's cunning with cautious admiration. German telegrams calling him unser bester man, our best man. The file was not thick, but it was heavy with suggestion. Reading through it, I began to sense not merely the story of espionage, but of transformation. A man who began as a thief, remade as a liar, who somehow, through deceit, found a strange kind of integrity. I paused at one photograph in particular, Chapman sitting in a small cafe in Oslo, cigarette in hand, his eyes half-lidded, a smile hovering between arrogance and melancholy. In that expression, I saw something deeply human, not the sharp lines of a spy, but the tired calm of someone who has lived too long in disguise. And as I read deeper, I began to realize that the true cost of deception is not exposure, but memory. For how can one remember who they are when every day requires a different mask? Perhaps that is why he fascinated those who knew him, not for his espionage, but for his ability to vanish into his own myth. Yet myths, like smoke, never linger forever. Time catches up, even with the most elusive shadows. And in the final chapter of his life, Eddie Chapman would find an unexpected peace, not in glory, but in anonymity. Eddie Chapman lived quietly into his later years, in a modest home near St. Albans. The once dashing spy had softened, the charm replaced by a gentler humor, the ambition by something almost tender. Neighbors knew him only as Mr. Chapman. Few suspected that this man, who fed birds and tended his small garden, had once fooled both Hitler's intelligence service and his own government. On summer evenings he would sit by the window with a drink in hand, watching the light fade across the rooftops. Sometimes he would hum a tune from the old days, a swing melody from a London club long demolished. In his final interviews he reflected with remarkable calm. "If I could do it again, I might have lived more honestly. But then again, honesty never saved anyone in wartime." He passed away in 1997, aged 83. His funeral was quiet, attended by family, a few friends, and one or two aging intelligence officers who had not forgotten. They placed a small wreath with no name, only the word zigzag, and for a moment the air seemed to hold its breath. And so, as we close this strange chapter of history, we return once more to the question that haunted Eddie Chapman's life: can deceit ever serve the truth? History is rarely kind to contradiction, yet it is made of it. Eddie Chapman embodied that paradox: a criminal who saved lives, a liar who told truths, a man who found meaning not in virtue, but in deception. He never fit neatly into the mold of hero or villain. Perhaps that is why his story endures, because it forces us to look closer at the blurred lines between loyalty and survival. In a war where propaganda painted the world in black and white, Chapman lived entirely in shades of gray. And from that fog, he taught an unspoken lesson: that courage sometimes wears the mask of cunning, and morality is often written in invisible ink. When I close his file and imagine him stepping out of that plane all those years ago, I think of how quiet the world must have sounded: just the wind, the parachute, and the heartbeat of a man who lived in plain sight, yet belonged to no one. The war has long since faded into memory. The fields he landed on have grown soft with grass. The cities he deceived now hum with the ordinary rhythm of peace. But sometimes, when dusk falls over the channel and the air grows still, I imagine that lone figure drifting down through the dark, a thief reborn as a spy, a man carried by silence into history. His story is not one of glory, but of humanity, of a restless soul seeking purpose in a world consumed by madness. In the end, Eddie Chapman was neither saint nor sinner. He was simply alive, and in surviving, he revealed something rare and timeless: that even in an age of war, there are those who fight not with bullets or banners, but with wit, nerve, and an unyielding sense of the possible. So let his memory rest not in the archives of espionage, but in the quiet understanding that courage wears many faces, and sometimes one of them smiles like a thief in the dark.